Kevin Sumlin is recruiting like a national championship contender, but will he have one on the field in 2015? We bring in Brittnee Taylor Newman of football.com and to talk about the Aggies, Brittnee. So the talk centers around Alabama and Auburn with a touch of LSU. And of course, Ole Miss and Mississippi State shook things up a little bit last year, but you want to talk about those Aggies?
Well, I think they're the most underrated team this year, perhaps in the entire SEC, and not just in their division. But what we've seen with the SEC, obviously, is it can become any man's game at any given point. And I think if there is a team that is poised to be able to take advantage of that this year, it's definitely Texas A&M.
Okay, we have something working today because we just talked about Georgia, and I just kind of followed along because I agreed pretty much step for step. And if there's one team that I've been touting during the offseason as a dark horse, not that I've picked them to get to the college football playoff, but I'm excited about Texas A&M, and I'm very interested to see what they have, because when you mount top 5 recruiting classes on top of each other for 3 consecutive seasons, at some point, if you've assembled a coaching staff that knows what they're doing, you should be able to squeeze that talent out and make it happen on the field. So the defense has been deplorable for the most part since joining the SEC, but this might be the breakout year.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think at some point, something's got to give. And I think this could be the year, with a division that's that stacked, you've got to kind of have a little bit of help from fate there in some places. But I absolutely think this team is going to end up being better than people have been kind of poo-pooing them down not to be. And I've got a couple of reasons for that. The first, I think, is the hiring of John Chavis. The defense was a really big weakness for them last year, and I think that he's really going to be able to help them with that. Obviously, he got his start at Tennessee under Phil Fulmer and then worked at LSU under Les Miles. In the last year that he was at LSU, they were 9th in the nation in total defense. So we've seen the numbers, we've seen the results from that. I think that we'll be able to see some results pretty quickly on the field at Texas A&M because, as you said, Kevin Sumlin has done a great job of recruiting. So there's some talent waiting there for him already, which is good. And I think the other thing that you've got to look at on that same side of the ball, there's a couple of breakout players. They're returning a lot of starters to their defensive line. So they're part of my number 2 reason. And a little guy that we know, well, he's not a little guy, a gentleman that we know as Myles Garrett, had 11.5 sacks last year, broke the SEC freshman record, a record that was set by another gentleman that we know as Jadeveon Clowney. So he's already gotten off to a great start in his college career. I expect to see more from him on the field this year. My 3rd reason, they're wide receivers. They're returning 6 of the 7 wide receivers that they had last year. So they've got a lot of depth there, which is really going to be important. Kyle Allen's going to be loving that for sure. A couple of standouts, they've got a guy named Josh Reynolds, 52 catches last year for 842 yards, 13 touchdowns for the season. They've got a new player coming in, Christian Kirk. He was the Arizona Gatorade Player of the Year, 5-star recruit. I expect to see some noise on the field from him even this year. And something that I saw that was interesting when I was pulling up recruiting notes is the third year in a row that Kevin Sumlin, speaking of recruiting, has pulled in a 5-star receiving recruit. So he's been stacking good players up year after year. And in Kyle Allen, I think they've got a talented quarterback, but if you don't have that receiving core there, who's he going to throw to? So number 3, the receiving core, I think that's a big part of why they're going to be formidable on the field this year. And number 4, I think especially in this part of the SEC, it is so important where you play, what week, who you're playing, where it's at in the season. Those things give you such an advantage. And when you look at their schedule and how many of those games they're playing at home and who they're playing away, I think that they've really got an advantage there with a couple of key losses at other schools that are more recognizable names like Auburn and Alabama. There may end up being a door open for them that they're really ready to run through.
Okay, let's see if I can somehow tackle all that. I'll start with recruiting. And I hear it mentioned from time to time that recruiting rankings are overrated. they're really not. There are individual cases where they're overrated. Yes, particular players miss. They become busts. Scouts say this guy's the next this or that, and that particular player's a bust. But in volume, the recruiting rankings tell us a whole lot. If you look at NFL rosters, and if you look at conference and national championship teams and top 10 teams that produced on the field, it goes back to recruiting. 4 stars are huge. That needs to make up the bulk of your roster if you're going to win a conference like the SEC. And when you start to spit out 5 stars, those guys aren't just walking down the street all over the place. There's like 25 to 30 of them every year. So there aren't a whole lot of 5-star guys. Looking at the receiving situation at Texas A&M, I don't necessarily think they have one guy that's the best or one of the top 5 even in the SEC. I had none of them rated in the top 5 in the SEC. I don't believe in my rankings, but I think as a group, I think it's the best wide receiver core in college football. Speedy Noyle, Ricky Seals-Jones, I think those 2 guys are ready to break out. They've been fairly productive, but I'm looking for big catch seasons, big productive seasons out of them. You mentioned Josh Reynolds. He actually wasn't as highly touted as his peers at wide receiver, and you threw out the stat, 13 touchdowns. So he and Kyle Allen built a rapport. He was dangerous in the red zone. Kyle Allen won the job officially the other day. I don't think there was any question about that, and I was extremely impressed with this kid, considering he got thrown into the fire as a freshman last season, true freshman. So he steps in against Louisiana Monroe and looked awful, and they limped through that game and won by like 10 points. Then the next week, he goes on the road to the Plains at Auburn and pulls off an upset and throws up like 45 points on Auburn. And the rest of the season, he continued to develop. He had a great bowl game against West Virginia. I think Kyle Allen's going to be a star this season, and that passing attack is going to be fun to watch. So my big question mark for this football team's on defense. We mentioned the lackluster performances in the past. I think the big difference from moving from the Big 12 to the SEC, they've made the transition offensively. They've made the transition even in terms of overall winning percentage. There hasn't been much of a downgrade in Texas A&M's performance, but defensively, they run around and they chase wide receivers every play in the Big 12. They've come to the SEC and they have gotten smacked in the mouth by Alabama and LSU in particular, and Arkansas the last couple seasons, and they're going to have to toughen up. And I want to see a tougher mindset and mentality and tenacity on defense out of this team before they're able to contend with the Alabamas and LSUs. The schedule, I've got it rated the 5th toughest in the SEC, and of course that's saying a whole bunch. And finally, thank you, Texas A&M. Thank you for scheduling an out-of-conference opponent. So it's been full of Sam Houston State and Rice and Lamar and SMU for the past several years, and there's still a lot of that on this particular schedule. The Ball State game, Nevada. You have to play some softies, I know, but they've been void in their schedule since joining the SEC. Playing one tough non-conference opponent, and they're going to be able to showcase their team on opening night against Arizona State on that Saturday, September 5th. So I really like that game, and I think that's going to be a bit of a barometer because Arizona State is no joke. They are a legit top 15 team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point, and that's going to be a catchy one for them. That week 1, and that first week. I mean, we saw it where, Ohio State was able to lose in week 1 in a game that they really felt like they should have been able to win, and they were able to overcome that. But not every team is able to overcome a stumble in week 1. So that'll be interesting to see how they handle that. And I know we talked about this a few minutes ago with Georgia, but I think if they're able to kind of utilize the rest of September to sort of get settled in and handle some of those defensive issues that you mentioned before they jump into the meatier part of their schedule, that's really going to help them.
Yeah, my one last note on the schedule, it's a given that everyone in the SEC and in specifically the Western Division is going to have a difficult schedule, but it makes it more manageable when you look at the crossover games and see who Texas A&M's playing in the East. They've got a date against South Carolina at home, and they've got what is should be close to a scrimmage against Vanderbilt. So there's the rest of the SEC, and then there's poor Vandy hanging down there after losing all 8 games last year. So they catch a bit of a break. They missed Georgia. They missed Tennessee. They missed Missouri out of the SEC Eastern Division.
Yeah, I think what really is going to help them is how many of these teams they're able to play at home. Like I said, I think that's kind of one of the biggest advantages that they've got this year. So we'll see. Obviously, fate always has to intervene in the SEC West a little bit. Once the cannibalization starts, we'll see who's able to emerge from all of that. But I think this is one team that may be able to take advantage of it and get past some of the more recognizable powerhouses this year. I mean, I'm all up on Auburn. They're going to be really good, but with a few key slip-ups, Texas A&M, this could be theirs to take.
Brittnee Taylor Newman joining us from football.com. Texas A&M has owned the state of Texas, pulling it away from the University of Texas in the recruiting rankings, owning the state from a swag or chic standpoint. Let's see if they can produce on the field a little bit bigger than they have in the past few years and losing 4 and 5 games. Brittnee, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.